Hello, welcome to this lecture on gender and sexuality. This is a fun one. And before we get started, if you have the PowerPoint in class, the PowerPoint is way bigger than what I'm going to go over in this video today. This topic just has so much stuff, and I've put together a lot of things over the years, and so feel free to look through the slides to see more topics and more things and more data and more whatever, more examples, more funny stuff that I've put together. There's a whole example about somatic norms and how we are expected to look, feel, smell in certain specific ways depending on gender. So there's a cool bit about shaving that I've got put together. I've also done some research on gender representations in video games. That's not in these slides, but if you're interested in gender representation in video games, I have various conference presentations and summaries of my own research in other PowerPoints that I'm happy to share with you and just to talk to you about this stuff because I find it utterly fascinating. Gender in not just video game advertisements, but video game culture as well. Anyway, getting started here. In our society, we see the terms sex and gender used interchangeably all the time. And I'm making the same connection here between when we talked about race and ethnicity, how people use the terms race and ethnicity interchangeably, but they're different. Remember, race is a socially constructed category based on real or perceived biological or physical differences between people. Whereas ethnicity is a real or perceived category, ethnicity is a socially constructed category based on cultural differences of language, of traditions, of religious background. So race and ethnicity are different, although we talk about them as the same a lot of the time. We need to be able to distinguish them. Sex and gender are the same. So you've seen on surveys before the question like, select your gender, male or female. That question is wrong because those are not gender categories. Those are sex categories. So that survey question is actually referring to sex. Male and female are sex categories that refer to biological differences determined by sex organs and secondary sex characteristics like body hair and other physical differences like body size that are unrelated to reproduction. Understanding the differences between these two terms, sex and gender, is essential, just like understanding the differences between race and ethnicity is essential for understanding this larger topic and being able to talk about it in society and being able to talk about it intellectually and as a sociologist. So when we think about sex, we think about male and female. But there are other sex categories. There are other biological sex categories, one of which is intersex. This is something that many people have not heard of, but it is a very real thing. About one baby in 1,000, their numbers go all the way up to like 1 in 10,000 on the low end, to 1 in 1,000 or so on the high end. I've even seen as high as like 20 in 1,000, like 1 in 800 or something like that. Babies are born what's called intersexed. That means that they have characteristics of both sexes. So they may have like an undeveloped penis or a very large clitoris. Stuff like that makes them unable to be categorized clearly into one sex category or another. Oftentimes this has to do with chromosomal differences, but this is a function of biological sex. Oftentimes what happens, well, historically, with these intersex children, and the reason that nobody's ever heard of this before, is because doctors used to make decisions to perform surgery on the genitals, or to say that this child is a boy, or this child is a girl, and the parents would say, yes, we're going to treat this child, we're going to raise this child as a boy, or we're going to raise this child as a girl. They weren't raised or treated as intersex, right? They were put into one of the two categories. More and more these days, parents and doctors will sort of not assign a specific sex category. They might say, like, this child is intersex. We'll wait and see what happens, or something like that. So this is actually a biological category that sort of throws a wrench into the idea of male or female. Gender is different. This is more like ethnicity. Gender relates to the ways in which a person behaves based on their biological sex. So in other words, we learn how to act manly or womanly based on the sex that we are assigned at birth. Gender is a term that describes our behaviors as either feminine or masculine or somewhere along that continuum. In American society, it is often expected that women will behave in feminine ways and men will behave in masculine ways. You all know people who don't fit this description clearly, or who behave with varying degrees of femininity or masculinity. People who do that, who sort of violate these norms of women behave like women and men behave like men, these people often face sanctions or negative stereotypes because their behavior contradicts the expectations of society. So gender is understood better as a continuum rather than as a dichotomy. This is also why I have a picture here. You've probably been wondering, why is this here? Of Spider-Man posing like Star Sapphire from the DC Comics. Spider-Man is a male and Star Sapphire is a female. That is their sex categories. In terms of gender, you would say that Star Sapphire is a woman. She conforms to societal expectations of how females should dress. She's in pink, right? Scantily clad like this. Should talk, should think, should behave, and so on. Spider-Man, similarly, is, well, a man. And usually it's more obvious. But this picture highlights that these categories that are gender categories are socially defined. So Spider-Man here is giving a feminine pose and is dressed like a typical female character in comic books. And that goes against our norms of masculinity. This is why Star Sapphire, on the right, looks normal, posing like she does, but Spider-Man looks weird doing it. You look at Spider-Man and you're like, what the fuck? Like, why is Spider-Man like dressed like that and posing like that? This image is from a Tumblr. It's an old Tumblr called the Hawkeye Initiative. It redraws male characters and female characters' poses to make the argument that women's poses like this on the right are not necessarily strong or empowering, as the argument often goes. You draw a man like that, and you realize how contorted the body is, how sex characteristics are highlighted with fabric barely covering the nipples, the crotch accentuated, skin showing seductively on the upper thighs, and of course always wearing high heels. Why? Well, because women wear high heels, and because it accentuates long legs and butts and puts you in a posture that is sexually appealing or whatever. Spider-Man, to me, does not look empowered at all. So understanding the relationship between our categories of sex and gender helps us make sense of ourselves and the social world, our media, because how we think about people of different sexes and genders, how power is unequal between people of different sexes and genders, how sex and gender are shown back to us or reflected back to us through media. And all of this, again, is really parallel to racial and ethnic categories. For example, just like race and ethnicity, sex and gender and sexuality don't always align. You got to keep that in mind. So creating, defining, and negotiating these categories affects all of us in our everyday lives. From which bathrooms we can use, to who we can marry, to our risk of experiencing sexual violence, to the roles that we are encouraged to play in society or that we are discouraged from playing, to how we see people like us in media, politics, and other institutions. These are old ideas, like old categories, but they haven't always meant the same thing as they do now. In some cases they have, and I draw your attention here on the right. If I can get my, you can see on the right, the three symbols, right? These are, you see these in biology, especially when you're looking at genetics, like Mendelian genetics and everything. But these are these symbols for Roman gods. Well, the top two are, the third one is not. The top one represents the god Mars. He's the god of war. And the middle one represents Venus, right? If the top one is Mars, the middle one must be Venus. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, that whole idea. And represents, well, she was, actually I'm not really sure what Venus was. Do you know what Venus was? Maybe she was some sort of, it's probably feminine in some capacity. But anyway, God on the top, Mars on the top was the god of war. Why does that top right one represent a male? Why is it masculine? There's that arrow sticking out. Lots of people say that's phallic, but that's technically not it. That's supposed to represent a spear. But maybe you could argue that spears are phallic. Then the middle one, it represents Venus. It's supposed to represent what's called a distaff. which is a tool for spinning wool, right? You sit down in the home with this thing and you make blankets and clothes or whatever out of it. You spin wool. That bottom one is just a symbol, one of the many symbols for transgender identities. So you can see it's got both the male and the female and a mixture of the two, maybe intersex or something like that. So you can see just in those old symbols for Mars and Venus that sex and gender are related, right? They are symbols representing sex categories, but there are cultural characteristics attached to those sex categories that align with what we consider to be more masculine or more feminine. So Mars, the man, the male, is off fighting, right? Using a spear, it's a very phallic symbol, but he's off fighting. He's doing like manly things in war. And the woman, Venus, her symbol represents, homemaking, domestic work, making clothing, wool, spinning wool. So there's long, this association between sex and gender, but we want to tease these apart, right? Because it's really different to tease them apart. Sex is biological. Gender is based on biological categories, but are all the cultural assumptions and meanings that we attach to those categories. So we tend to think about this as a binary, right? We tend to think about this male or female. And we talked about this, how this is complicated by intersex children. Same thing, masculinity and femininity, or men and women, is complicated as well in terms of being a binary. Think about these as more of a continuum. You can think about sexual orientation as the same sort of way. Also a continuum. People aren't simply straight or gay. People are in between. There's people who are bisexual. There are people who have same-sex encounters sometimes and have heterosexual encounters sometimes, but identify as either straight or gay. There are people who identify as asexual, which means they're not sexually attracted to people and they don't identify as any sexuality. There's a really famous study, and you can read about this a bit in the textbook. I think they go into detail some. Lots of studies by a guy named Alfred Kinsey and his research assistants. And they studied human sexual behavior of Americans in the middle of the last century, which was rare back then because sex was very taboo in conservative, traditional 1950s-ish America. But they surveyed tons of couples and tons of American adults, married, not married. They did observations, which involved them watching people getting intimate. And they developed a scale of sexual behavior based on all their data. And they showed this, like way back when we typically think about, this very kind of black and white culture back in the 50s, that there is a scale of sexual behavior, that there are people who are exclusively heterosexual. There are people who have incidental homosexual encounters. So like they're straight, like they're mostly straight. They probably identify as straight, but they have had a homosexual encounter. And the same thing on the other side, right? People who identify as gay but have had heterosexual sex before. So there's this continuum of human sexuality. We tend to think of it as black and white, as either or, but it's not. It's simply not like that. So think about how we conceptualize these categories versus how we tend to think of them in everyday life, right? The difference is not always obvious, but it's there. So you and me, all of us, we perform these identities. We perform gender, we perform sexual orientation. That's how you know, for example, how to be a man, or how to be a woman, or how to act straight, or how to act gay. Or more specifically, you probably are more aware of how to label others who are acting in non-normative ways. That is, you know what it means to sound gay, right? You know what this means. Certain ways of speaking, certain ways of using hand gestures, depending on whether you're a man or a woman, that tend to be perceived as representing a particular sexual orientation or representing a gender identity. So your gender identity is your self-definition of your sense of gender, right? So how do you perform your gender? You can think about this. How do you perform masculinity? How do you perform femininity? How do you up-key one or another at different times? How do you do this? Why do you do this? Think about how you're dressed, for one. So I'm looking at myself. I'm wearing pajamas and a t-shirt, pretty neutral. But I'm not wearing anything feminine. I'm not wearing like a dress. I'm not wearing high heels. These things that are typically considered feminine. I have short hair, right? This is like a man's haircut. I have this like watch on. Oftentimes like watches are seen as masculine, although mine's just a Fitbit. It's not like a big Rolex or something that men are more likely to wear. When I go out, I don't carry a purse. I walk in a certain way. There's all sorts of things. I mean, you can think about the million things that you do. And when you go out, observe other people as well and see how they perform gender identity, or see how you interpret their gestures and their behaviors as representative of gender identity. Or rather, you don't necessarily know their identity because that's their definition. Just like you don't know someone's sexuality. Was the only way to know someone's sexuality? You talk to them and they tell you what it is. Otherwise, you don't know. What you can observe is behavior, but behavior and identity do not always align. So we always express our gender. We always perform gender. That is behavioral manifestations of gender. We do this through clothing, through hairstyle, through mannerisms, etc., etc. We do the same thing with sexual identity. We perform sexual identity. We may have a particular orientation, the inclination to feel sexual desire toward people of one or more genders, right? That is, if you are homosexual, you feel sexual desire toward, or romantic desire as well, toward someone who is of the same gender as you, and vice versa. But right, these things do not always align, and this is really important because we typically operate on the assumption that they do. There's a well-known sociologist named Michael Messner, and he makes this point really clearly. He says that our perception of other people's sexuality is not actually, I'm quoting here, is not actually about sexual practices or preferences, but is instead about their performance of gender. Individuals who display and perform what society considers the correct gender are never asked to defend their sexuality. However, those who are thought to display and perform gender inappropriately are constantly challenged about their sexual identity. So you can think about this. In instances when you have seen people challenged about their sexual identity, why were they? Like, what were they doing? Chances are they were performing in a way that seemed inconsistent with their gender performance, right? So it may be someone who looks like they conform to masculine norms, right? They're dressed like a man, they've got a man's haircut, they might have like, I don't know, they look like a straight guy. But then when they talk, or they have a mannerism, or they touch someone in a certain way, all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, they're not performing their sexual orientation according to how I think that their gender orientation should mean that they're performing a sexual orientation. Like, they look straight, but they're acting gay, this sort of thing. And oftentimes that's what prompts a question, right? Oh, is so-and-so gay, right? I hear the way they talked, or something like that. So we tend to think about these things as aligning, but they do not align all the time. All right, there's a wonderful video here. Actually, I realized that I have not given, oh, okay, good, it's popping up. But I didn't give you the title like I did in the last video. So you can search this on YouTube. It's a video from The Onion, which is a parody news website. So this is meant to be funny. And you can search it, I guess, it says Today Now, Finding Masculine Halloween Costumes for Your Effeminate Son. And this is about that difference between gender performance and sexual identity, how we tend to assume that they align, but they don't always align. So watch this video, and I'm assuming that you're pausing it, and then you're going to watch the video. And now I'm assuming that you've come back. Okay, so now that you've seen this video, what is the parents, the author's fear in this video? Their fear is that their son is too effeminate and will therefore be seen by others as gay. This is a not uncommon thing that parents think, right? Parents parents want to know what their child's sexual orientation is. And there are signs, right? The signs are, do they conform with societal expectations of gender performance, right? If you have a son and they don't conform with societal expectations of masculine gender performance, parents may think that their son might be gay. This is a reason why kids are bullied in school all the time, because they don't perform gender appropriately. You can think about the same thing with girls as well. So in the video, what do they say? They give some examples of like what is too effeminate for the sons, right? For these effeminate boys. What's too effeminate? Well, how do you know? They skip delicately instead of walking normally. They have a lisp. They bat their long eyelashes, right? They have beautiful eyes and eyelashes. They want to be a pastry chef. So there are certain occupations that are seen as not conforming to gender or sexual norms. You can think about all sorts of other occupations, right? Women who work in traditionally masculine occupations, like a women construction worker, might be more likely to be labeled as a lesbian than a woman who, is an elementary school teacher, right? Something that's very gendered. Being a flashy dresser, right? A man who's a flashy dresser. And it depends because, some of these things are either or. Like a very heterosexual ladies' man kind of man can be a flashy dresser. But we have a stereotype about gay men being flashy dressers as well, dressing nice. So how does the author in the video propose to solve this problem? Well, they decide in sociological terms to have the effeminate male child perform masculinity in a more socially acceptable way by dressing up as very masculine things, a soldier, a vampire. What was the other one? There's the bear costume, which is funny. The robot, right? Because she says the world of science fiction is a great place to look for masculine outfits for your son. Everything's very violent, and right, you're associating violence with masculinity. And I'll ask you, I think this video is funny. Most students usually do, but why might the video be funny? Well, sociologically, it's funny because we assume that gender expression aligns with sex, and we assume that gender expression aligns with sexual orientation, but it doesn't always. So the people in the video chose costumes that weren't as masculine, weren't as definitively masculine or heterosexual signaling as they thought. So she cautions at one point, make sure that you don't choose something like a firefighter that's been co-opted by the gay community. The vampire is a flashy dresser, so you have to be careful about costumes with flashy dressers. The bear, which is really funny because bear is a term in gay male subculture referring to someone who prefers particular sexual positions and has particular attitude in relationship to other kinds of gay men. So the bear costume is funny, and I always think they're saying something about furries as well, which people assume is a subculture that has to do with sexuality and all sorts of stuff. So these representations of these costumes can have both masculine and feminine elements. The vampire, who is a flashy dresser, right? You could say that's more feminine. But both representations of the costumes could be seen, from lenses to have elements of heterosexuality, of homosexuality, of masculinity, of femininity. So the point here is that sexuality, that gender performance is more fluid than we tend to think that it is. That sexual orientation and gender performance are often presumed to align, but they don't always. And another sort of point here is that identity and behavior are not the same thing. So you may identify as something, but behave in a different way. I will use gender and sexual orientation as an example. Then you can read research on men in prison, right? Male prisoners. Well, identity and behavior are not the same thing because most male prisoners who have sex with other male prisoners say that they are straight. So their sexual orientation, their sexual identity is heterosexual, but their behaviors do not align with our definition of that identity, right? They have gay sex, but they're straight. And that's the case, right? Go back to Kinsey's scale, right? They may have incidental homosexual behaviors or incidental homosexual encounters. And if you tell them they're gay, if you walk up to them and said, hey, I think you're gay, they might punch you in the face or something like that. Who knows? So it's important to tease all these terms out. There are other important definitions to know here. Cisgender, or cis, people oftentimes misspell this if they've never seen it spelled S-I-S, it's C-I-S. A cisgender person is someone whose gender identity aligns with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So if you came out of your mother's womb and the doctor took a look at you and said, "It's a girl," so your sex is female, and then you grow up and your gender identity is a woman, then you are cisgender, right? The vast majority of people are cisgender. Their gender identity aligns with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Some people are transgender or trans. This is an umbrella term signifying an individual whose sense of gender identity crosses traditional gendered categories and differs from what is typically associated with their sex assigned at birth. So, same example, if you were, you came out of your mother's womb and the doctor, hit you on the butt, got you to cry and said, "It's a girl," and you grow up and you later identify as a man, that is, you perform masculine gender identity and you identify as the opposite gender, then you are transgender, right? You're a trans person. Your sense of gender identity can change. It is, remember, based on characteristics that we associate with sex categories, but it doesn't have to be your sex category. So a transgender, this would be, in this category, in this example, it would be a transgender man. So you use the gender term that the person identifies as now, right? So a person born female who identifies as a man is a trans man. I lost my train of thought there about why I went off onto that tangent, but trans or transgender is a preferred term. Transsexual is a term that you do hear sometimes. This does have a specific meaning, but don't call trans people transsexuals. This is not a term that is used in the community or in any of the academic literature or social movement literature or anything like that. But technically, a transsexual is someone who has had a sex change of some sort. They've had some sort of operation or physical alteration of their body at the kind of chemical or primary sex characteristic level to change their sex, taking hormones or something like that. A transgender person is not necessarily transsexual, but anyone who is transsexual is likely transgender as well. So transgender is the umbrella term for it. But you can check out this GLAAD media reference guide for other terms. But it's important to get these straight as well, because you want to call people what they identify, right? You want to think about people's identities and address them how they want to be addressed, use the pronouns they want to go by. This sort of relates to their humanity. So examples of trans women, that is, people who were born as males, their sex category may still be male, but they identify their gender as a woman. That is, they perform femininity, they perform as a woman. Famous examples, right? Caitlyn Jenner, Laverne Cox from Orange is the New Black. If you've watched that show, she is a famous actor. Pronouns in this case, since you're referring to the person by the gender that they currently identify as, you use that gender pronoun. So these women are she, and you use the name that they identify as now. You don't use an old name. It's called a dead name. That is how you talk to people who are trans and talk about people who are trans. Okay, so on the flip side, there are trans men. Elliot Page, most recently, with a Time cover, "I Am Fully Who I Am." And this guy down here at the bottom, Aidan Dowling, who's on the cover of Men's Health several years ago as a trans man. So these two, Elliot and Aidan, were born as females, right? And they were assigned the gender of woman when they were born, or girl. I guess you're not a woman as an infant, but did identify as women and transitioned to identifying as men. You can look, I've added a couple sources down at the bottom of the PowerPoint slide that look at the difference between transgender people and transracial people. This idea, I talked about this in the previous lecture with what's her name? The woman who passed as being black, the white woman who passed as being black. Can't remember her name. But I was making the argument in the previous video that I was making the argument how transracialism is different than transgenderism. And I've repeated that here, but I've given you two articles. I've given you one that's like a pro article that's like these things are different and should not be considered the same thing. And I've given you a con article, one saying like these actually should be considered the same thing. It's really interesting debate. Definitely worth browsing those two articles if this is something that you are interested in thinking about. But since gender is a socially constructed category, we can apply the same sorts of ideas to notions of sexuality. There was never really a need for an explanation of heterosexuality in the past, although this is something that has become central to our understanding of modern societies of sex and gender and sexuality today. Heterosexuality just was, and it still just is. But since we're thinking about gender as a social construction, then we do have a need for the origins of concepts. And like I've said in this class before, every concept has an origin. We talked last time about how race has an origin, how racial concepts originated and were, defined over time. Categories of gender obviously are like that as we see in today's culture, but sexuality as well. And we can look back to see how concepts have evolved over time. Right? They were something different than they are now. This is always the case, but we tend to think that the way that they are now is the way that it always has been, or the way that it should be, like the only way that it should be. And if you just take one look at anything historically, you see that that's a quite narrow way of thinking from our own time about anything. So we don't perceive that there's a need to question something that has always been there, but what if it has not always been there, right? Like our modern concept of the identity of heterosexuality. Heterosexuality, of course, has always existed. Otherwise, there would have never been reproduction, right? People have been heterosexual. People have had heterosexual sex. That's been such the norm that it was never discussed until in the last century. It was never discussed as an identity, right? As the way that we currently think about heterosexuality as an identity, oftentimes as opposed to homosexuality. So you can see this timeline on the left. In 1868, heterosexuality and homosexuality were first coined, right? These words didn't exist before then, and they were coined because this was the advance of medicine, and so there are all sorts of new medical terms being coined. But they were obscure medical terms for a long time. It's not until 1901 that we get a dictionary entry for heterosexuality. And in 1901, the dictionary entry for heterosexuality was an abnormal or perverted appetite toward the opposite sex. It wasn't a good thing to be called heterosexual, which is funny to think about today. In 1923, it's become introduced into Merriam-Webster's, the famous dictionary. Morbid sexual passion for one of the opposite sex. Again, not a good thing, right? You didn't want to be called a heterosexual. It was like a mark against you, right? You're perverted in some way. It's not until 1934 that the dictionary definition of heterosexuality comes to look like what it does today. Manifestation of sexual passion for one of the opposite sex, right? Hetero meaning opposite. And they define it specifically as normal sexuality. Now, so I've already pointed this out, but just to clarify and relate back to what we've previously been talking about, there's a difference between heterosexuality, any kind of sexuality, as an act and as an identity. So like I said, the behavior of heterosexuality has always existed. The behavior of homosexuality has a long history as well. Look back to ancient Greece, where it was not uncommon for older men to take younger boys and have sex with them, and then to enter into these relationships. But they didn't identify as homosexual or as gay in the way that we think about it today. There was like certain social norms governing those kinds of relationships that were seen as normal in that society. And it's not until the past century where we come to develop our own sort of formal term, medical term, or medical, but sort of like formal term for engaging in homosexual sexual behaviors and having an identity associated with it that is in contrast to a dominant heterosexual identity. So think about the fact that, or think about how language affects social norms and identities, right? Putting a label on someone's behavior or putting a label on someone's identity allows for the defining of something that is normal, and by necessity, if something is normal, then there's something that is abnormal. There's something that is deviant. And so heterosexuality, 100 years ago, is something that starts to it becomes defined as normal sex. It becomes defined as the normal sexual identity, as the normal sexual orientation, in opposition and against homosexuality, which was defined as the new sort of like perversion or abnormal sexual orientation. Prior to the introduction of these terms into the American vernacular, sex, prior to this time, sex was a very moral thing. And you can look at very old examples like in the Bible and religious texts to think about this. Sex was something that you were supposed to do for reproduction. Like, yeah, people had sex for fun, but it wasn't something that you were supposed to really talk about or be open about. And I'm thinking about this stemming from like the Victorian era and the, some of these more recent times in the U.S. where people in the U.S. or in Europe where people are very like, closed off with their sexual displays. There are lots of like rules governing relationships between people, but sex was a moral issue for reproduction. So the Bible, for example, one of the critiques against homosexuality and masturbation is that you're sort of like wasting reproductive ability, right? Like God gave you all this stuff so that you can reproduce and be fruitful and multiply. And if you're like masturbating and you're having homosexual sex, you're not doing it right, and it's an immoral act. It had not quite occurred to people by this time that they might be differentiated from one another by the kinds of love or sexual desire that they experienced, but this quickly became the case, that people began to differentiate one another through language and creating these categories to differentiate one another by the kinds of people they love and the kinds of people they have sex with, the kinds of relationships that they experience. So of course, in the past, sexual behaviors were identified and cataloged. So, but anything that was usually like perverse in some way or deviant in some way was typically forbidden. The emphasis was always on the act, not the person doing it. That is, the identity had not been developed yet. It was the act itself that was immoral or bad, not necessarily the person. So, in the 20th century, in the interwar period, and before that, during industrialization, there was a large urbanization of the country in the United States, with many more people in a particular place. It becomes harder and harder to police people's behaviors, to police people's morality. There's so many more people. You can't watch that many more people. With urbanization also came a huge rise in the number of poor people in urban centers. So poverty was a huge problem during the time that these terms were introduced in the Industrial Revolution in the early part of the 20th century. It's always a huge problem, but sexual deviance was something that that came to be associated with the lower class. Sexual deviance is something that came to be associated with those who did not have status in society. Upper class people, wealthier people, politicians, religious figures, the like real classy kinds of folks, like they weren't sexually perverted, right? They didn't engage. They didn't go to like they didn't hire prostitutes. They didn't do all the things that were deemed deviant at the time. And so this definition of heterosexuality, of having a passion for someone of the opposite sex, becomes normal in part against this sort of rising tide of all these immoral behaviors and all these problems associated with poverty that included sexual deviance. So other kinds of sexual deviance and homosexuality as well become associated with urban centers, with poor people, with immigrants, with all these kind of like social groups that were on the bottom of society. So finally, though, sex starts to shift I got cut off on the previous slide. The cat started shifting and I thought it was doing something weird. Anyway, end point on the previous slide is that as sex becomes less about a moral imperative for reproduction and becomes an expression of erotic desire, that desire is able to be controlled and policed, right? So there's certain kinds of erotic desire that is acceptable, and that became that became heterosexual erotic desire, and certain kinds of erotic desire that became unacceptable or abnormal or deviant, and that became formally homosexual or same-sex sexual desire. Okay, so on to this slide. This is a reflection of what has come to be known as heteronormativity. This is the idea that heterosexuality is and should be the norm, right? We live in a heteronormative society. Heterosexuality is the default. You are generally assumed to be heterosexual unless you give off some other indication otherwise. There's all sorts of, I'll do a big list in a minute. We also live in an andro-normative society. That is, that assumptions of maleness or masculinity are the norm. And these are heavily reflected in language. There's a, I guess he's on Twitter, but I see it on Facebook because I'm old and I'm on Facebook. A handle called "Man Who Has It All." It's really funny. It flips andronormativity and heteronormativity on its head. So this one I pulled out. This guy saying, "Will you stop calling me a male CEO? I'm just a CEO," shouts Angry John, bringing his gender into everything as usual. We see this all the time. Where people will say, oh, like a woman CEO or a female CEO or usually a woman something that is usually a man, and then a woman will say, like, I'm just a whatever, like I'm just a CEO, and people will say, oh, quit bringing your gender into it. You see this all the time. You see this reflected in language by all of the different suffix man, like fireman, policeman, things like this, and you see how silly it looks when you flip it around. So this. Frank, a male firewoman, says, I don't mind being called a firewoman because I know it covers both women and men. Anything else would sound silly. Well, we do the opposite all the time, and it doesn't sound silly, right? Sandra, a female fireman, this sounds way more normal to us than Frank, a male firewoman. Why? Because we take the idea of this the fireman, the masculinity, the andronormativity being encoded in language, we take that as normal, and we don't really challenge it or question it. But when you flip it on its head, all of a sudden it looks weird, and so you realize how weird this might look to people who are not part of the dominant group, right? When you stop to think about it. So you can think about this in terms of sexuality as well. I'm on the left here. This is from I don't remember the source. This is something from Twitter, but the questions here are pulled from like an old scholarly article exercise or somebody who's like an old gender studies person. I don't remember the source. You can probably Google it and find it. But these are interesting questions, right? And you can read them. But I'll ask you some more. Can you express your physical attraction to your partner in public without being sanctioned? If your partner is the opposite gender than you likely can do this without fear of repercussion, without anybody saying anything to you. In most situations, you can hold their hand, you can even kiss them in public, and it's probably fine, and nobody probably cares. But if your partner is same-sex, it's a little trickier to navigate. Do you assume that people are straight until they announce that they are not? Yeah, you do. You look for signs, maybe. Indications, gestures, and information that people give off as a clue to their sexual orientation, but barring anything else, you assume people are straight, right? You don't assume that everybody walking around is gay. You assume everybody walking around is straight until they let you know otherwise, or until you read other information about them. That's a really good example of heteronormativity. Do your friends ever announce that they are straight unless it is a conversation about the LGBTQ community? If they do, in what context? I've got a good example. A good example of sort of drawing boundaries between categories. And this goes back to the discussion we were having of trans people as well. We're very interested in drawing boundaries around these categories, right? It is wrapped up in our own definitions of ourselves and our own sexual identities and our own gender identities and how certain we can be in those things. It's wrapped up in how we think the social world should be, and how we think that gender categories should operate. So anyway, I have a stepdad. This is my story. I have a stepdad. Well, an ex-stepdad. He and my mom have been divorced. So I have an ex-stepdad. And one time we were in Thailand. They were visiting me when I lived over there. And we were in Thailand, and we were in Bangkok. Actually, I don't know if we were in Bangkok. We were somewhere in like a city center. In Thailand, there are a lot of trans women. Colloquially, sorry for the text, colloquially, they are called ladyboys. This is the local term for trans women. And they're everywhere. And they have a lot of, they have a fair amount of rights in Thai society. People are, much more accepting of them than Americans are of trans people in the United States. And you see trans women, you see ladyboys everywhere. Anyway, my stepdad and I were sitting at a bar overlooking a street. And his name's James. My stepdad's name is James, so I'll say James. James was watching the people walking by, and we were watching the people walking by. And he would comment on women that he saw. That one looks like, look at that one. She's got an Adam's apple. Like, that one's really a man. Look at the way that one's walking. Like, that one's really a man. Look, that one's got big feet. Like, that's not a woman. Like, that's a man. And just commenting on like every woman, right? Oh, look, that one's a woman. Yeah, you can see like how narrow her neck is. Like, whatever he had to comment on, he was commenting on. And I like kind of listened to him, and he'd been doing this for the whole trip too. And eventually, I was just like, dude, James, why do you care? Why does this matter to you so much? Like, who cares? Who is really a woman and who's trans and who's a man? Like, why are you so concerned with identifying people? And he said, I'll tell you why. I'll tell you a story. And I was like, okay. And so I sat back and sipped my beer and waited for his story. And his story was that when he was in college, when he was a younger man, he went to a bachelor party for a friend of his at a strip club. And his friends ordered him a lap dance from one of the strippers. And so he went upstairs with the stripper and was getting his lap dance, and he was thoroughly enjoying his lap dance, right? He was aroused. He told me he was thoroughly enjoying it. His hands were going all over this woman. And eventually his hands went downstairs, and he discovered that this woman had a penis. And he threw her off, jumped up, yelled some expletives, went back downstairs, and was mad at his friends. Why is he telling me this story? He's telling me this story because he feels that he was tricked, right? He feels that he was tricked by this stripper who was a trans woman, or who was performing as a woman. And when he told me this story, I was thinking about it, and I think about it in terms of this class and in terms of this kind of lecture. And James is straight, right? James, his sexual identity is straight. He's very, very, he's very masculine. He's very certain about his heterosexuality. He's a straight dude. And so this experience really disturbed him because he realized, I think this is my interpretation, right? Is that he realized that he could have sexual attraction to a male, right? He realized that it didn't matter that it didn't matter what someone's sex was, right? What someone's genitalia was, that he could be attracted to someone who is simply performing femininity, right? Whose gender identity was a woman, but who may not have been female, and that he could be sexually attracted to that person. And so it sort of like messed with his sense of security, of his very solid certain identity as a straight man, because he didn't see sexuality as on a continuum, like you're either straight or you're gay. He didn't see gender as a continuum, you're either a man or a woman. And this experience like really kind of threw a wrench in his conception of all this stuff, and he did not like it. So he got mad at his friends, and that's why he wanted to sit on the street in Thailand and tell me which person was really a woman and which person was born a woman. It's interesting, but I think that served to sort of like flip. It served to flip his assumptions about gender and about sexuality and about sex. There's another. This is not a story. This is a short film. It's like 10 minutes or 12 minutes or so. I want you to watch this short film. This turns our notions of heteronormativity, more so ANDRO normativity, because this is about men and women, about gender, not about sexuality. It turns them upside down. So this is a short film about flipping. Somebody's burning some stuff, and it just got super smoky outside. There's smoke coming inside. I hope that's not the house. There is what are they? Oh yeah, okay, so what would happen, right? What would happen if women occupied men's position in society and men occupied women's? I want you to watch this video, this this short film, and think about how gender roles have been flipped in the film. As you watch it, what seems strange to you? Well, actually go watch it and then come back. It's like 10 minutes, go watch. All right, I'm assuming you've watched. It's called Oppressed Majority. If you couldn't find it, go watch. Okay, now I'm assuming you've watched. So what seemed strange to you in the film? How did men act? How did women act? What kinds of jobs did they have? What kinds of roles in society did they have? How did they dress? How were men made to feel in the society? Who had more power in certain situations? How do you know about the power differentials? How did different people feel about their bodies? How was the main character sexualized and why? Think about sexual violence here in this video, the reasons for it and the responses to it. Are these similar to or different to how people experience and report and are treated for suffering sexual violence in our society? You can think about that. Think about how this flips androcentrism on its head. And then I hope this helps you think about how our particular constructions of gender are not natural. Right? I don't mean that they're not like okay or like they're not like. What I mean is that they're not natural, right? It doesn't have to be like that, right? Everything that we think about gender and sex and sexuality doesn't have to be the way we think about it. We think about it differently than in the past, and it will no doubt change again in the future. So here's another example about sexuality. This video is like wild. Don't watch it yet. My point in this one is that our attitudes toward categories of sex, gender, and sexuality have real effects. Not all societies are as accepting of homosexuality as the United States. Many are better, many are worse. So in this video, you see just briefly what it might be like to be gay in Russia, specifically to be a gay man in Russia. This video gives us like a glimpse. It says that 2 men pretend to be gay in Russia. After watching the video and having listened to the lecture, you should be able to point out the problem with this title immediately. I'll come back to the problem with the title, but watch the video and observe how the 2 men are sanctioned and note what they are sanctioned for doing. All right, so go watch, then come back. Okay, so first, the issue with the title. I said there was an issue with the title. The title said that 2 men pretend to be gay in Russia. Well, Gay is a definition of sexual orientation defining all the meanings surrounding how we are sexually and or romantically attracted to others. This video, more specifically, is not about being gay in Russia. It's about two men holding hands in Russia, right? The behavior, the very specific objective behavior, is two men holding hands. The behavior here is not homosexuality, is not being gay. That's not the behavior. You've got to be able to think about teasing out behaviors, identities, labels. These things are not the same, right? So what are they doing? They're holding hands. It's two men holding hands. Does someone holding hands with someone of the same sex mean that you're gay? Of course not, right? For the people, in this video, yeah, so the clear dominant definition in Russia, or in this part of Russia, it is that if you're holding hands and you're two men, then you're gay. But think about it. For women, girlfriends hold hands together all the time, especially younger girls, right? Like girls in grade school, teenage girls. Maybe as you get older, it decreases. So your gender depends on whether you are allowed to hold hands with someone of the same gender. When I lived in Singapore, when I moved there, I noticed that foreign workers from South Asia, oftentimes Bangladeshi workers, they held hands, like these were men, they would hold hands. And I remember thinking like, wow, I didn't know there were so many gay, like Bangladeshi dudes. Like, that's weird. Like, that's not what I would expect. I thought they were like more conservative and like maybe they weren't into that. But I learned over time that they weren't holding hands because they were gay or because they were dating the person they were holding hands with. That it was a common thing that friends did among men from that part of the world who were working in Singapore. So the gesture itself, holding hands with someone of the same sex or the same gender, is no certain evidence of homosexuality. It's not evidence of anything in particular, but it is evidence of whatever we think it is evidence of. Does that make sense? Like, it's evidence of whatever we think it is evidence of, and we will act toward people depending on what we think it is evidence of, as you see in the video. So if they think it is evidence of homosexuality and they dislike homosexuality, then they will treat these men as if they are gay and according to the social norms about homosexuality. So what all did you see in this video? How did people respond to the two men? Did you see examples of prejudice? Prejudice is simply ideas about the characteristics of a group of people that people apply to all members of the group, regardless of sort of how true or false or likely to change or unlikely to change it is. Prejudice usually manifests in discrimination. So prejudice is an attitude or an idea. Discrimination is a behavior or something that results in treatment, in differential treatment. So did you see discrimination? Did you see unequal treatment of individuals based on their membership in a certain social group? Yeah, you did, right? You saw people talking, turning their heads, yelling things, and you saw that guy at the end physically breaking those two guys apart. Those are all examples of discrimination. In that case, you see individual discrimination. That is discrimination carried out by one person against another. And you can sort of argue that you see institutional discrimination here because all of this pattern together is sort of like representative of larger social norms. But what institutional discrimination really is discrimination carried out systematically by institutions, that is politics, economics, educational systems, and other institutions that affect many members of a group who come into contact with it. You definitely saw what's called microaggressions with the head turns and the language as well. Microaggressions can be acts of discrimination. Microaggressions are everyday uses of subtle verbal and nonverbal communications that convey denigrating or dismissive messages to members of certain social groups. So the talk and the looks are microaggressions, also discrimination. The tough guy at the end, right? And we all know he's like a tough guy, right? He's big, he's muscular, his voice is deep. He's like very masculine looking and sounding. The dude is clearly homophobic. And he's enforcing what we call hegemonic masculinity, which is he's promoting kind of traditionally valued characteristics of manliness and denigrating femininity in men or femininity in a masculine performance. So in this case, that's the two men holding hands. And this guy physically, this is interesting, thinking about how we create categories and boundaries of sexual orientation or of gender categories or of acceptable behavior or whatever. This guy is trying to, like, he physically establishes a category by, he physically asserts the dominance of like this version of masculinity over the version that these two men are displaying, right? He physically asserts masculinity over femininity. He physically asserts heterosexuality over homosexuality. He's making these boundaries like very rigid through threat of violence. And this is often what happens. Violence comes from a position, violence often comes from a position of privilege, of power, of being in a dominant group, and of invoking violence or doing violence to members of subordinate groups or members of less powerful groups. This is often how violence operates in society, especially at the macro level or at a large scale. So this guy is upholding categories of gender, of sexuality that are heteronormative, that are andronormative. We uphold categories like this all the time through our performance of gender and sexuality, through everyday interaction, through our discriminating behaviors, through labeling deviance, through humor. Think about what behaviors are acceptable in public restrooms, or what behaviors are unacceptable in public restrooms. Students often differentiate in their answers to this sort of prompt by gender. So for example, women in my classes are much more likely to report that to say that it's more okay to talk to people in the bathroom, to talk to a stranger in the bathroom, whether you're asking for toilet paper underneath the stall, or you're commenting at one another's looks in the mirror, or doing makeup or something like that, something feminine, right? This is more acceptable for women to do. It is less common and less acceptable for men to just strike up a conversation with a stranger in the bathroom, especially in stalls. Men are more likely to see something like this, right? This public service announcement here about which urinal you should use. And in this public service announcement, they also state that you shouldn't fart loudly, you shouldn't talk on the cell phone, you shouldn't chat with anybody else, you shouldn't smoke, and no looky-loos, right? You shouldn't sneak a peek at anybody else in the bathroom. But they give you this nice chart here that you can see. The green urinals are the ones that are acceptable to use if someone is occupying the one indicated. The X's are the ones you should not use, right? So if somebody is, there's people on either ends, you should use the middle one out of 5. If there's somebody on one end, you shouldn't stand next to them, right? You should only stand next to somebody in P if you absolutely have to stand next to somebody in P. But these sorts of rules or images, about how to behave in women's restrooms are less common. And this is part of the whole phenomenon of gender socialization and of sexual socialization. This shows men how to behave as men and as straight men in bathrooms. My final point here, and you can watch this video or not, but my final point here is that we are socialized to be men or women or gay or straight or whatever. None of this stuff happens naturally. I pointed out previously in class that your gender socialization starts before you're born. Parents give you a name, oftentimes before you're born, and that name is likely coded masculine or feminine. You're purchased clothes, your room is painted, you have toys, people start to buy things for you, depending on whether you are going to come out as a boy or a girl. And so immediately people start to see you as one way or another. And if people are starting to see you and think about you as one way or another, they're going to start to treat you immediately as one way or another. There's tons of research, for example, showing that parents are more likely to be rough, especially fathers, with their male sons, their infants, their male children, especially as infants, than their female children, like throwing them around and stuff. Because, right, boys are tough and they rough and tumble and they play. They're more like physically hardy, even though actually female babies are more physically hardy. The survival rate of female babies is higher than that of male babies. But we are taught what it means to do something like a girl, for example. We are taught that to do something like a girl is usually to do it badly. And this is often used as an insult against boys. You run like a girl, right? You throw like a girl. What does that mean? You do it badly. You do it weakly. You run slowly. Oftentimes, like a girl is an insult. Not always. You can think of some examples where it's not. But we learn this stuff, right? Through language, through all sorts of aspects of gender socialization, through different agents of socialization in the family, in school, through media, and so on and so on. I do want to make a point, because we talked a bit about gender inequity and gender inequality in various forms. We haven't gone into specifics in the lecture, but you can read the textbook to look at gender equality, real effects of gender inequality in terms of health, in terms of lifespan, in terms of housing, in terms of mental illness, in terms of wages and wealth, all sorts of different stuff. But it is really key to understand that gender inequality harms men too, right? Any kind of inequality doesn't only harm people who are suffering the inequalities. Gender inequality harms people who are in the dominant group as well. So for men, for example, men face pressure to be breadwinners. That is a great pressure. Even though women are working more than ever, we still have a cultural stereotype that in the end, and many people believe this very strongly, that men should be the ones to go out and earn money and go work while women should stay at home, right? More and more this is not the case, but it's still overwhelmingly the case. Men have a burden of emotional expression or inexpression. Men are taught to bottle their emotions because this is masculine, right? To just like not show emotion, or actually you can show some emotion. Which emotions are you allowed to show as a man, right? Anger is acceptable, jealousy is acceptable, aggression is acceptable, and even encouraged in many ways. I mean, just watch an action movie, right? But other emotions are less acceptable. So boys don't cry, right? Even though we understand very clearly that crying is a healthy emotional outlet. Don't cry all the time, 24/7, but crying has function, useful purposes. So this burdens men emotionally, and in terms of mental health, and in terms of emotional expression and emotional health and all this stuff, to not be allowed to show certain emotions. Let's see. Oh, men have way higher risks of stress-related diseases, in part because of all that emotional bottling, in part because of various burdens that men feel, that men tend to feel for possibly being a breadwinner or for being responsible for the well-being of a family or something like that. The kinds of jobs that men do are more dangerous overwhelmingly than women do, right? Men tend to work in construction, and those kinds of jobs have much higher mortality rates, and men die younger. They do. Men die on average in the United States like 5 years younger than women. This is a problem, right? Part of this is explained through ideas of masculinity where you don't need to go seek help, right? You don't go to the doctor if you're sick. You don't always go to the doctor, right? You can deal with it. You're a strong, tough man. You don't need to go to the doctor. You don't need as many social relationships, right? You're like a lone wolf, like you're tough. But you do need relationships, especially when you get older. And more of your friends start to, do different things or die or whatever. Older women tend to be much healthier than older men, in part because they're way more willing to maintain and engage in new social relationships than men are. And they're more willing and likely to go to the doctor if they can than men are. So for these reasons and many more, men tend to die younger and more violently, as a result of perhaps aggression and things like this than women do. Men are more likely to take risky behaviors, and this is all part of how we are socialized to be masculine or feminine, right? Plenty of women are take risky behaviors, and plenty of men do not do risky behaviors. We can learn, we can unlearn, And that's my final thought here, is that the gender roles that we have in society, the meanings that we've attached to gender, to sexuality, the stereotypes that we use, these have been constructed, which means that they can be deconstructed and they can be reconstructed as well. So if we're thinking about inequality in terms of gender and sexuality, if we're thinking about discrimination in terms of gay rights or trans people, we have created the boundaries, we've created the categories that we have, we've created the meanings that we have, and these have specific effects on people and their life chances, and the amount of time they can expect to live and all this stuff. If we can create these things, we can uncreate these things. Like, we can redefine these things. We can redefine gender roles, modify them so that things are a bit more equal, while keeping the gender roles that we like, while keeping the aspects that we like, but getting rid of the aspects we don't like. So women can still be women, men can still be men. We can recognize that gender is more fluid than it's traditionally been seen. We can try to nullify or mollify the adverse effects of femininity or masculinity, and just sort of like take things that are working, that are doing well, that that give people higher quality of life, better mental health outcomes, physical health outcomes, better relationships, better for children, so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. We can do all this, right? So that's my final thought. Skip ahead through a bunch more slides if you're interested, and I appreciate you watching this. Hopefully it was interesting. I like giving this conceptual overview rather than going into details about kind of specific aspects of inequality or whatever. I always like the conceptual stuff. So I hope this was thought-provoking and interesting. Feel free to email me any questions if you have questions about it, and I will see you all shortly. Thanks. Bye.